Welcome to the Salt Lake City Planning Commission. Today's date is Wednesday, August 14th, 2024. The Planning Commission consists of residents from each Salt Lake City district that are appointed in a manner providing balanced geographic, professional, neighborhood, and community interest representation. The Planning Commission reviews and acts on any changes to the city's general plans, small area plans, special studies, zoning ordinances, and zoning district maps. The Commission also reviews and acts on planned unit developments, conditional uses, and certain subdivisions. Our goal is to provide a welcoming and safe environment for everyone. We ask that those in attendance adhere to a few ground rules. 1, silence or turn off your cell phones. 2, respect the person speaking and do not interrupt or do other things that could intimidate or deter others from exercising their right to be heard. Clapping, cheering, jeering, shouting, or other actions used to discourage people who have different opinions from participating will not be tolerated. People who attempt to diminish someone else's input may be removed from the room. 3, if you wish to speak, come to the microphone once the public hearing has been opened and state your name. Members of the public will have 2 minutes to comment. Your time cannot be combined with someone else's time. Everyone will get the same amount of time to speak so that we can ensure everyone is treated equally. If you are a representative of an officially registered recognized organization and the item you wish to speak on is within the boundaries of your organization, you will be given 5 minutes. If it is outside of your boundaries, you will be given 2 minutes. 4, if you have a handout that you want the commission to see, you need to leave copies because they become part of the legal record. 5, when commenting, speak clearly and keep your comments on topic and brief. 6, questions asked during a public hearing will not be answered during the public hearing. Rather, the commission may ask the applicant or staff to answer questions after the public hearing is closed, or ask city staff to follow up with you at a later time. We will go ahead and move on to our agenda. First, we have the report of the chair and the vice chair. The chair has nothing to report.
Vice Chair has nothing to report.
We will move to the report of the director.
Hi, good evening. It's good to see you. Rick Tuttle has resigned from the Planning Commission, as you know. So we will be sending out recruitment materials, and we really would like to focus on District 2 and District 3. So you will see some email blasts tomorrow, and probably some social media as well, so that you can get some fellow commissioners on the commission. So just one announcement there. Another announcement that I wanted to make is Kelsey and myself had a briefing with City Council yesterday to go over the D4 changes to authorize the Smith Entertainment Group for the D4 zone, and answer some questions for the council. And they had a public hearing yesterday evening where a number of comments were provided from the public. And I think the vote to be set to authorize that entertainment revitalization district will be on the 27th. And then I'm going to hand it over to Catherine.
As part of those D4 zoning changes and in connection with that project, in general, there was a lot of discussion before the City Council about development agreements. And just as like a mini training session, development agreements, as I'm sure everyone is aware, are tools that the city has when there's a legislative or otherwise discretionary approval that's being sought. In that case, that's the participation agreement for the Culture and Convention District. As part of that participation agreement, SEG agreed to enter into a development agreement. So consistent with Utah law, as long as the development agreement, or you don't really need a development agreement if they're going to comply with the underlying D4 zoning. But if they're going to do more than what's required by the underlying zoning, that approval does not need to be reviewed by the planning commission under Utah law. It's only if they are asking for exceptions, so doing less than what would be required under D4 zoning. So in this case, only if there is going to be, an exception to what, any property owner in the D4 would be asking for, or pursuing in terms of development, would a development agreement be done that first needs to be brought to the planning commission for a recommendation and a public hearing. Development agreements are done all of the time by the city council that require more things, so that's why than the underlying zoning, and that's why you don't see those development agreements. But a lot of times when, things that are required, by your recommendations or that are departures do ultimately, they're not really cast as development agreements, at the planning commission stage, but are later incorporated into a development agreement at the city council stage. So that's maybe some of the discrepancy in process that we see for a variety of applications. So for example, the housing loss mitigation program that was, often brought before you in those reports where existing housing or replacement housing needed to be put on the property. That was never really, discussed as, they have to do a development agreement to do this, but that is how that regulatory tool is effectuated once, that rezone was done, and at the city council level, that requirement got put into a development agreement. So just so that you have that mini tutorial on development agreements.
Are you going to give that mini tutorial to council? Because last night, when I said that the development agreement, I said basically what you said. It would not, the development agreement, I testified at council that the development agreement would not come to planning commission unless it in some way needed something from that was not anticipated in the D4 zoning. In other words, it needed some kind of exception to the D4 zoning. And they were saying, oh no, it's going to come to you. So I think that the actual confusion is more with the members of the city council.
I believe that they are definitely aware that that development agreement, if it allows something more lenient than the D4, that has definitely been part of the conversations that I've been in, absolutely, with the council. Thanks. And that's all we have. Thank you.
Thank you. We will move to the open forum. If anyone has anything they'd like to bring up. We will move on to the consent agenda. We have two items. The first item is planned development major modifications for Regency on 9th at approximately 1580 South, 900 West, which will have a public hearing. And that is case number PLN PCM 2022-00426. And we also have the approval of meeting minutes from June 12th. Oops. Yeah. Oh. Yep. Well, it does say June 12th, June 26th, and July 10th. And we will go ahead and open the public hearing on item number 1. So if there's anyone who would like to give comment on that item, go ahead and approach the microphone. Have we received any emails?
No.
Thank you. We will go ahead and close the public hearing on that item, and we will call for a discussion on the consent agenda or a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
I'll second.
We have a motion to approve the consent agenda from Commissioner Burrows and a second from Commissioner Scheer. Any discussion to the motion? We will go ahead and vote. If you were absent for one of the meetings, let me know, and we will mark that as an abstention. Commissioner Gale.
Yes, I abstain from approving of the June 12th minutes and the June 26th minutes as I was not in attendance.
Thank you. Commissioner Berry.
Yes, with abstention for June 12th, as I was not here.
Thank you. Commissioner Scott.
Yes, and abstain on the last two.
Okay. Commissioner Burrows.
Yes, but I abstained from the voting on the minutes for June 26th and July 10th because I wasn't there.
Thank you. Commissioner Scheer.
Yes.
And the chair will also vote yes, and that passes unanimously with 2 abstentions on the 12th, 3 on the 26th, and 2 on July 10th. We will go ahead and move to the regular agenda. Our one and only item on the regular agenda is rezone at approximately 238 South Concord Street and 1255 West Pierpont Avenue. Case number PLN PCM 2024-00389. And our staff contact is Olivia Svetko.
Thank you, and good evening. Tonight, I am presenting a request to amend the zoning map designation for 2 abutting properties in the Poplar Grove community. It is 238 South Concord Street and 1255 West Pierpont. Here is an aerial. The existing zoning for these 2 abutting properties is R1 5000, single-family residential. The request is to change the zoning of these 2 properties to RMF 30, low-density multifamily. All right, our subject property here outlined in blue is roughly a 1/4 acre combined with the 2 parcels. There is currently 1 single-family home on the combined property that is being rented. Oh, sorry, it doesn't want to move. There we go. Okay. So the West Side Master Plan provides some direction and guidance for how the city should process these requests, specifically for this community. And on the screen in front of you is a portion of the future land use map from this plan. Everything in yellow is designated as neighborhood. You can see the subject property highlighted in red towards the top of the screen. There is no specific zone designation called out in the neighborhood designation for this future land use plan, but it does provide some guidance saying that properties, future development is appropriate in areas near these identified nodes, like the one you see on the screen on the map. And in areas with appropriate infrastructure to support growth. Additionally, the plan calls for a desire to use underutilized or undeveloped land for infill development. Staff feels this request is consistent with the West Side Plan's guide to use underutilized or undeveloped land for infill development. The biggest difference between the R1 5000 zoning district and the requested RMF 30 zoning district is the type of homes that are allowed to be built on these properties. In the R1 5000 district, single-family dwellings are required a minimum of 5,000 square feet per lot. The current area of these two lots could support 2 single-family houses and a accessory dwelling unit for each one, for a total of 4 units. Additionally, if the applicant chose to utilize the affordable housing incentive, this could be increased to allow a 4-plex on each lot, for a total of 8 units. The requested new zone, the RMF 30, allows for a wide range of different housing types, including single-family dwellings, 2-family dwellings, row houses, and multifamily residential, all which require 2,000 square feet per unit, which would equate to roughly 5 units for the subject site. They also allow cottage development, sideways row houses, tiny homes, and multifamily residential for 1,500 square feet per unit, which would, in theory, allow about 7 units on this site. Okay, so here are our standards of approval for an amendment to our zoning map. You'll see in your staff report a full analysis of these. I do want to note that this application was received and deemed complete prior to the adoption of the community benefit and tenant displacement amendments. So this request is exempt from that. However, I'll let the applicant talk a little bit more about his plans for the redevelopment of the site, but he is proposing family-sized housing units, which I believe meets one of those benefit requirements, and he's well aware of that the city wants to see more of these benefits with this type of proposal. And lastly, staff has not received any further comments on this project. We did receive a letter in support from the Poplar Grove Community Council. And based on that and the findings in the staff report and that I've covered tonight, staff recommends that the Planning Commission forward a positive recommendation to the City Council for the proposed zoning map amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have the applicant go ahead.
Get your PowerPoint.
And remember to state your name for the record.
Just let me know when you want to switch.
My name's Anthony Wright. Thanks for having me tonight. Hopefully, I'll be pretty quick. Olivia did a really good job in her staff report, so I don't want to rehash everything she did. Just kind of highlight a few key areas that I think are worth noting about the property. Kind of to give you better context of the location and access for the property. It's located at the convergence of Concord and Pierpont along I-80. And then there's an alleyway that services the west of the property. So 3 of the 4 sides are actually surrounded by road. The city owns a big piece of vacant property to the east that connects to the Jordan River. That's somewhat abandoned. They put up fencing actually, so you can't access the river. I'll talk about that later in the presentation though. But as Olivia stated, there's one house on the property right now. It was built in the 1880s. Really charming, cute house. It does have a brick foundation that was damaged in the earthquake, but we hope to repair that. That would be our goal. If we go next. Thanks. So kind of get some property background. My brother and I purchased the property in 2014. We were both in our early 20s. I was working at the Home Depot and he was working at a tennis club part-time jobs, and we got approved to buy a house. And saying that to some kid who's 22 nowadays just doesn't seem fair. Used to be obtainable, and we see this as an opportunity to hopefully provide people with the same opportunity that we had back in 2014. This is something we've been considering for a long time. In 2018, we did a lot line adjustment to try to see if we could add any more density within the R1 zone. The RMF 30 zone didn't exist at that time, so I've been following it and was really happy and watching it come to fruition, because I think it provides a lot of options to create missing middle housing options that are greatly lacking in this city, and seem to stop being developed in the early 90s when most of the code was adopted. So I was really happy to see that there. I thought this was pretty cool to share. I found an even better one than I included in my application. This is an aerial from pre-I-80 construction showing the subject property that used to actually be two separate properties, and the impact of I-80. Just thought it was worth sharing just to kind of show what's going on there. Kind of back to the 2018 lot line adjustments when we were trying to add another single-family house. To meet the street frontage and setback requirements, the configuration of the parcels was just very strange. One had to face Pierpont, one faced Concord. Makes it really challenging to develop something that's actually functional and provides a benefit to the Pierpont Avenue Street, which I touch on in my application, and I'll talk about that a little more. So like Olivia's mentioned, I mean, the bulk setback and height requirements are really similar in RMF 30. The difference is the density, square footage per unit, and while it does allow, say, 7 cottage houses, it's really not possible or practical with parking and setbacks. And we really want to build detached single-family houses that are family size, so 3+ bedrooms. We're looking at a plan right now that's 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. So just something a little bigger, but not huge. We want it to match the neighborhood. What we have now with the 2 parcels really only allows us to build 2 really big houses with an ADU in the back. It's not economical, and you're really only adding 1 family to the neighborhood. And this is a real driver in our plans and what we want to do, and I can explain a little more. The dead-end nature of Concord and Pierpont with I-80, it's just been a nightmare of just crime and illegal dumping. And I think the reason is, and talking with the city as well and the police, is there's no eyes on Pierpont Avenue. A true street frontage doesn't exist. It's 2 people's backyards, an alleyway, and then I-80. So we'd like to configure whatever we do to have the majority of the fronts of the houses facing Pierpont Avenue and create a true street frontage with eyes on the street, making it feel a little more like a neighborhood and not a freeway frontage road. There were 3 guiding principles that led to this application. As Olivia mentioned, the West Side Master Plan, the existing built environment, and then recent city rezone initiatives that I was watching really closely that actually kind of gave me the courage and pushed me over the line to go through the application process, with the most recent being 13 South and 1050 West as part of the West Side Infill Housing Initiative that the city's undergoing, which is really similar. By the Jordan River, empty parcel. I kind of use that as inspiration, I guess. To point out 2 additional pieces in the West Side Master Plan, page 34, that talks about special single-family allowances as well as multifamily infill allowances, and not to just reread it, but one of the things I found is the unique shapes of the parcels and the impact on adjacent properties would be negligible due to the unique characteristics. As I showed, the parcels are very weirdly shaped, and it's surrounded on 3 or 4 sides by road, not adjacent neighbors. You have I-80 to the north, the city frontage to the east, so it's kind of on its own little peninsula. So I think the impact would be negligible and actually beneficial to the area. This is a graphic just showing a very tedious exercise I did on the interactive parcel map, clicking on every house around me, seeing if they would meet the current R1 5000 zoning. And I don't think most of the neighborhood does. It either doesn't have the lot widths, the lot sizes, the setbacks are encroaching on the property lines. There's mixed uses. The boxes with the arrows point to multiple higher density projects that are zoned R1 5000, yet are within close proximity, a block or 2 of the subject property. And the area highlighted in blue is city-owned parcels. So it's like a park, Alzheimer's Park, and then the Jordan River access. And then, as Olivia mentioned as well, it's one of the benefits of RMF 30 is it provides a mix of options. These are just kind of to show what is possible. Personally, we don't like townhouses and row houses. My brother and I, we want people to have their own yards, parking, fee simple ownership. That's the hope that we have to move forward. Just another fun graphic just showing the state of Utah has the largest average home size, which I think could be contributing to our lack of affordability. These are some real world examples as well as a graphic in the middle, just kind of showing other cities that have cottage developments and court streets and how they can be incorporated into a neighborhood. These two that are real world examples are actually the exact same square footage of lot as ours, showing that they can actually fit 6 units with a shared common space. Just added density within a city without changing the character. And then I'm sure, as a lot of you guys are aware and have driven around, there's a lot of court streets and built environment within our city that would never be allowed today under the R1 zones. A lot of them have been rezoned to SR3 now, but they exist all over the city, so it's not a impractical development solution. And kind of just to finish up, the Emerald Ribbon Action Plan was launched a couple years ago. I've reached out to them as well as the Poplar Grove Community Council. I want to do a CIP application to, you can actually see in the photo, there's the gate and the Jordan River access that's kind of been abandoned. Want to work on potentially putting a bridge there. So across the freeway, they're doing a kayak and canoe launch ramp. And further south, they're doing a lot of improvements, but this stretch has kind of been forgotten. So I just want to see if we can do a bridge or some kind of improvement to that access point for the community and the property as well. And with that, any questions, happy to answer.
Thank you. Any questions from the commission?
Olivia, thank you. This is a great staff report. I did find a negative letter in our Dropbox that you didn't mention. So we did have at least one person who didn't want this to happen.
Apologies, thanks.
I'm just noting that for the record, that in case that person
Yes, thank you. I'm so sorry.
thinks we didn't get their letter. We did.
Mm-hmm. We did get one negative comment that you guys should have.
Let's go ahead and open up the public hearing on this. If anyone would like to comment, go ahead and approach the microphone. Have we received any emails?
No.
Thank you. We will go ahead and close the public comment and bring it back to the commission for discussion. Motion.
I think that the staff report was really good and straightforward and easy to understand, and it was a really good application too, with a lot of information. So, and I think that's could be a great little part of that neighborhood. So good luck. I hope you design something awesome. Is there a prohibition against, regardless of the zoning, could that home that's currently on that lot be removed or demolished without a replacement plan?
Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe it can. It is a very charming and very old home, but it is not a contributing structure in a historic district or a landmark site or anything like that. So I believe it could be demolished without a plan. Is that right?
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'm ready to make a motion. Based on the information presented and the discussion, I move that the commission forward a recommendation to adopt this zoning map amendment to the City Council.
I'll second.
We have a motion by Commissioner Scheer and a second by Commissioner Barry, any discussion to the motion? Let's take a vote. Commissioner Scheer,
Yes.
Commissioner Scott,
Yes.
Commissioner Gale,
Yes.
Commissioner Barry,
Yes.
Commissioner Burrows,
Yes.
and the chair also votes yes. That passes unanimously and moves on to the city council. Thanks.
Thank you.
We will move to the briefing section of the agenda. We have one item, which is zoning consolidation project, case number PLN PCM 2024-00707. And we have multiple planners that we have Grant Amon, Kelsey Lindquist, and Amy Thompson that will be presenting to us.
Let's see. There we go. Yeah, we're going to break that up a little bit. Kelsey and I have the first part, and then Amy will be taking care of parking in a minute here. Thanks so much. Good evening, commissioners. My name is Grant Amon, and together with Kelsey Lindquist, we will be providing an informational briefing in order to break down part of the larger mixed-use zoning district consolidation project. The briefing that we will cover will be limited to updates to the land use table of the zoning ordinance, which is specifically chapter 21A.33. In order to fully understand the extent of these updates, I'll briefly explain the basics of the land use table chapter, so we're on the same page. What is a land use table? To break it down, a land use or use is a classification or category of how a property is being used. Now, a land use table land use tables list every zoning district in the city. Within each district, any given use is considered permitted, conditional, or not permitted. The land use tables list the zoning districts, uses, and whether or not the use is permitted or conditionally permitted in the zone. And then we have an example here on the screen on your left-hand side of what's currently existing in the code, and then on that right, there are just some uses that you might find in any given land use. Any given property in the city is permitted to be used for any purpose that is listed in these tables, and if the owner of the property desires to use the property for a use that is not listed or permitted, then the owner would have to consider alternative approaches or uses for the property. The city is proposing to streamline the city's zoning framework by consolidating various zoning districts and introducing a new mixed-use district land use table. The key goals of this initiative include keeping standards that work, maintaining existing property rights as much as possible, and maybe even make them more flexible in some cases, reducing new non-conforming uses, promoting a broader range of residential types, and encouraging mixed-use development. This proposal is part of the broader effort to simplify and improve our zoning ordinance. You have seen this chart before, hopefully, as part of this effort, and as a reminder, here are the proposed new mixed-use zones, sort of as background. Underneath each on the chart here, you will see the zones that are being consolidated into each of the new zones. Today, we are talking about consolidating the uses that are within each of the districts listed below each mixed use. So, just focusing on those uses. And for context, here's a map of those proposed MU zones. This will help illustrate the areas where certain uses will be appropriate in the city. For example, as you can see, MU2, which is that lighter orange color, currently includes neighborhood commercial districts such as CN, commercial neighborhood, and RB, residential business, and includes uses like small scale retail, little restaurants and stores. MU11 on the other side, that purple one, includes more industrial commercial districts such as CG and FBUN 11, and uses such as self-storage. You'll see those closer to the highway. All right. Here is a land use table. As far as the actual written code is concerned, the largest change included in this briefing is the replacement of the commercial land use table with a new mixed use district. I wasn't sure how to visually display that, but the red will be deleted and the green will be the new mixed use. This will be necessary because of the consolidation that you saw earlier. The commercial districts by themselves will cease to exist. Also being removed would be references to the commercial uses in other commercial tables, such as the TSA, downtown, FB, and GMU gateway mixed use land use tables. The residential district's land use table will be impacted as well by the removal of the RMU, RB, and RO districts. And FBUN1 will be added to the mixed use table because it functions as a residential zoning district. Next, this consolidation aims to remove inconsistencies and simplify the application of land use regulations across different zones. These are some examples of some inconsistencies that our current code has. The current use framework contains numerous inconsistencies, including 18 different types of retail, as well as varying qualifying provisions such as indoor or outdoor classifications of the same use, proximity qualifications, and size restrictions as well. The updated land use tables aim to address these inconsistencies by standardizing classifications across the board and removing unnecessary distinctions. And I have a few examples as an overview. I'll briefly describe 3 large land use categories that would be updated. First, as stated, there are currently 18 uses that could be classified as retail, including a division in retail goods and retail services. This update includes both in the same land use category, so it would get rid of the individual distinctions. These changes are intended to broaden the applicability of these categories and to reduce the complexity of zoning classifications. And then you'll see the same thing with recreation, going from outdoor and indoor recreation to just keeping them all in the same one. Next, the proposed updates also include removing the indoor-outdoor language from all listed alcohol-related uses. This change is aimed at simplifying the regulatory framework for businesses involved in alcohol sales and service. And then again, sort of in that same retail category, the following changes are proposed: removing department store, fashion-oriented department store, pawn shop, specialty, and mass merchandising to kind of categorize them under retail, and then we would include in this mixed use store, pawn shop to be made separately from the overall retail category. These changes reflect a move towards broader, more inclusive categories that are easier to apply across different zoning districts. Several other zoning categories, land use categories, will seek updates, including the removal of specific uses such as bed and breakfast inns. Bed and breakfast itself will remain. Non-registered and registered daycare, home or preschool, you'll see there. And government facilities sort of act as a retail use anyway as well, or an office use. These changes are part of an effort to modernize the zoning code and remove outdated or redundant classifications. All right.
I have the fun portion of the discussion. So new non-conforming uses, just to provide a framework for what a non-conforming use is. We consider non-conforming uses to be, so they were allowed at one point under your zoning, and then zoning changed. Now it's not an allowed use, so we consider that a non-conforming use. Through this project, we are creating some new non-conforming uses. That's primarily driven by the consolidation of CG into the MU11 district. So if you'll go back to the map, Grant.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You'll see the MU11, which is the darkest purple on the map. You'll see that it follows the I-15 corridor, also follows I-80. It's also in Sugar House. And then it's near the 3rd West corridor in like kind of Western Marmalade area as well. So really dispersed throughout the city. CG, as it currently stands, allows a plethora of commercial uses. That includes industrial assembly, sexually oriented businesses, large, heavy automobile salvage and recycling, large automobile repair. And so when looking at the consolidations of all the zones that are being consolidated into each of these new proposed mixed-use zones, the team looked at what is mostly permitted across the board or conditional across the board, and we tried to keep those P's and the C's the same. CG was the most challenging. So now if you'll go back to the chart.
Yes.
There are a number of uses that will become non-conforming for those properties that are currently zoned CG. So you'll see most of these uses on the screen do impact those CG properties. We are also changing some M1 properties to be included in this mixed use project. Those are primarily along the 700 West corridor. You'll be briefed with more information on that at a future date, but this, the land use tables will also impact those properties. They received a special notification so that we can have individual meetings with those property owners to go over the impact to their land uses. And the next slide. So to try to ease into the MU land use tables, we are adjusting the Chapter 37, which is the non-conforming uses, to allow for more flexibility for changes to non-conforming uses. The changes that we're allowing to have some flexibility on are larger increases to building footprints and replacement of buildings, as well as changes to the which allowed non-conforming use. What was that? Okay. Yeah. That's okay. So currently, the Chapter 37 for non-conforming uses is incredibly stringent on what is allowed to be modified if you have a legal non-conforming use, meaning it's limited to 1,000 square feet for an expansion or 20% of the building footprint. So we are increasing that allowance. Next slide. That's it. Okay. I know that was a lot of information in the last couple of slides, so I'm happy to dive a little deeper into non-conforming uses.
I would like to dive a little deeper into the increase in allowances to the non-conforming uses.
Okay.
How many non-conforming uses have you done an analysis of how many non-conforming uses will be created?
We have not.
Because
pulled
I
an
don't,
analysis.
based on that list of what you put out, I don't foresee a lot, but I think maybe mostly in those M1 zones is when you would perhaps see some of those conflicts.
We'll see some in the M1 and then the CG properties near 3rd West and in the Granary as well. And
So-
near the I-15 and I-80 corridors, we'll see
So-
some impact.
I feel like this isn't just out of curiosity, but I would like to understand better what some of those non-conforming uses that will be created
Okay.
by this consolidation, to really understand better if the allowances fit with
Like the proposed 37 changes.
the proposed allowances to those non-conforming uses to ease that are really appropriate, or if they may create some conflicts.
Okay.
I think I would like a little bit more info breakdown on that. in that Third West area, because I think right now, even along Third West, we're starting to see more residential build, and between 13th and 17th South, and so I can already. So just I think a little bit deeper review of that would be warranted, because I'm interested into what you're easing that in and allowing more allowances for modifications would really look like.
We can take
Okay.
a closer look.
Thank you.
But also, just to expand your point of the residential development, especially near Third West, we're also seeing it push deeper into some of these CG areas and near M1, where there is a significant land use conflict, where there's maybe heavy manufacturing or hazardous chemical production near residential developments. So part of this
Yes.
MU consolidation is to clean up some of those conflicts as well.
Yeah, I think that's a worthy endeavor. And I know that the existing ability to modify anything as a non-conforming use is extremely limited, but not everybody on the Planning Commission currently has had experience with how that has played out. So having a better understanding of how restrictive it is now, because I think the goal of how it is now is if it's non-conforming, you need to keep it non-conforming. Otherwise, you need to do it the way that the zone requires. So I think that might also benefit this current Planning Commission to understand how much that would loosen up.
Okay.
And maybe there will be opportunities that we could foresee that it could even be looser. I don't know. That's what I'm trying to get at, because the restrictions now are really somewhat odd in how they're calculated. So I think if we could do that, that would help, I think, all of us.
We can come back with that information.
I agree with that.
Appreciate
I think
it.
we don't, I mean, I think the way it's done now, it almost encourages non-conforming uses to stay non-conforming uses rather than do anything minor that would challenge that non-conforming use. And if this is loosening it up, then that's great. I mean, that's a good thing, so that people can actually make those small changes, you know, and as you say, ease their way into a better situation.
Let me just clarify.
Yeah.
So a non-conforming use, so non-conforming will always refer to a land use.
Right.
Non-complying will refer to some sort of dimension or lot and bulk issue, right? Typically with a structure or a lot shape. By allowing what's proposed in the amendment for a non-conforming use, so a building with a non-conforming use to expand, will not change that non-conforming use. It will change maybe a compliance, right? They'll always have to be in compliance with the underlying zone with their structure, but the non-conforming use with the flexibility, we would always consider them non-conforming.
No, I know, I understand that. I just think that there is the potential for some confusion.
Okay.
See more about this, just so we can understand it better. More,
We can bring
rather
it
than-
back. Absolutely.
I think you're going in the right direction. I just don't know for sure. I also have one other question, which is MU11 refers to a height as well, does it not?
11 stories.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a great deal of land now going to be zoned for 11 stories.
The CG, so under the downtown building heights, we did modify CG to be up to 150 feet within the identified area of the downtown plan. And so MU11 will actually match that allowance, and then we'll carve out some area for that additional height that we allowed in downtown plan.
Yeah, you were talking about some area in Sugar House, that's CG. I wonder if we can go back to that,
It's not
because that's...
CG, it's actually CSHBD1. So MU11,
So that area there, right?
right there, will be MU11. So that is what I was referring to, is CG is being consolidated with CSHBD1.
And there it is
So
as
that
well.
creates kind of some challenges when it comes to land use tables, right? Because it's applied in the heart of Sugar House, as well as, you know, it frames the freeways. and
What's the lower
interstate.
boundary of that district right there, just to... so I have a better idea of it. Is that the 21st South Freeway?
Yes, this
Yes.
right here.
Okay, so all of that retail, all of that area in Sugar House, all that retail where the new, it's
Yeah, that's all.
already zoned in that general direction, right?
Yes,
Sorry.
that's
Okay.
correct.
So, as a follow-up question that just occurred, does the MU11 have a buffer to natural areas? Because we have a natural area in with the current Sugar House Business District 1, and that particular core, it will probably jump at redeveloping after this is done.
I believe
And I know I
all-
brought this up, but I don't remember the answer of what kind of a buffer that's going to get.
I believe all of that's being carried over. You will receive a briefing. So the next briefing will be the lower MU zone, so MU2, 3, 5, and 6. And then we will brief the commission on MU8 and 11
Oh,
the
okay.
following time. And that's when we'll actually dive into the drafts. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Commissioner Barros, no.
My question is, with the allowances that you're considering on the non-conforming uses, those are going to apply citywide, right?
They would.
That's okay. So the balance there is, the purpose in having that pretty tight is to make sure that we're not allowing non-conforming uses to expand their footprint, correct? So I get that in this case, we're wanting to kind of soften the blow, but I think the consideration is that's expanding citywide, so there are going to be properties where people have had to keep their footprint small, maybe haven't been able to expand their business, which has been a non-conforming use, right? And then under this change, they will be able to make that change, maintain the non-conforming use, but have a larger area that they're maintaining that non-conforming use in, correct?
That is what we're trying to balance. So historically, I think the city's viewed non-conforming uses as, and probably many municipalities have viewed them this way, as hopefully they'll turn over,
right,
and they'll move to a different property where
Phase
it's the
them out.
permitted use, right?
Right.
You do. You phase them out. You make it more restrictive.
Right.
They move on. With this project, we acknowledge that a lot of these properties will become non-conforming, and we do want to ease that blow.
Right.
So it's something we're trying
to balance
It's a
that,
tricky one.
but it's going to apply citywide.
It
Yeah.
would. Yeah.
Okay.
Any additional questions?
I have a question about the outreach that you're doing to the public. You had a walking tour the other day. Was it well attended? Was it
So
were people
the,
interested?
the walking tour on Monday, we rescheduled to tomorrow because there was the
Torrential
crazy
storm.
thunderstorm. The
was-
weather's been
yeah.
actually really challenging. It's either 105 degrees or a thunderstorm. So that one is rescheduled to tomorrow. And then the Sugar House walking tour was supposed to be last night, but we bumped that into September so that the council members could attend. So we'll see what
Have people signed up for them and stuff like that? Yeah.
yeah.
Good.
And then we have 2 scheduled open houses as well.
So please sign up on Eventbrite in case
So
it's
these-
105 or, sorry.
Go ahead.
If we have a weather event, we'll let you know, because I didn't sign up for Eventbrite and I showed up with a 6-year-old in the rain and the wind. So please sign up. We'd love to see you there.
We
It
would.
was fine. I'm from the Midwest. I was like, what? Cancel this? Just kidding. Thanks.
So the things which are now will become non-conforming uses, will they be non-conforming for the entire city, or will there be a place for them to go? M1
There
mostly,
will be a place
M
for
and
them to
M2?
go. Yeah.
Okay.
It's M1 or M2, those kind of heavier industrial uses, and SOBs will be allowed there as well.
And the automobile salvage and
M1. We are allowing some minor automobile repair and some major in MU5 and 6 and 8, I believe.
Yep.
Yeah.
okay. So we're not allowing a zoo.
I believe
Bummer.
it's conditional in one of the districts.
Yeah,
Bummer.
I think so. Yeah.
Surprisingly, it was allowed in a lot of zones.
I was planning to do a zoo in my,
There are some weird land uses. Any other questions? Okay, we'll turn it over to Amy then. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hello. Hopefully this presentation briefing goes better than the last one. Let's see. So this is a follow-up to the July 31st briefing regarding Chapter 21A 44, which covers off-street parking, loading, and mobility. During that briefing, we received feedback from the commission emphasizing the need to zoom out, like way, way out, and provide a broader perspective on the chapter. There was a parking information sheet that was accessible to you last Thursday, and the presentation was uploaded for you on Monday of this week. So today I'm going to start just by providing a comprehensive overview of Chapter 21A 44, and that is hopefully to help ensure that the Commission has a solid understanding of that chapter's framework. And then from there, this will hopefully set the stage for you to ask questions and share feedback on the proposed changes and how they align with that overall framework. So again, this presentation is going to provide an overview of Chapter 21A 44. It will also go over off-street parking requirements in detail, and then briefly touch on the proposed changes with the MU consolidation. And then of course, there'll be time for discussion and questions. So starting with the overview of Chapter 21A 44, I'll start off with what regulations are included in this chapter. So first off is off-street parking. When we talk about parking regulations, we are talking about off-street, meaning parking on private property. This includes vehicle parking, bicycle parking, EV and ADA and recreational parking. This also includes parking location and design. So for example, how far back the setback is required for a parking lot, where on the property it can be located. So can it be located in a required yard area, that sort of thing. And then off-site parking, driveways and access, standards for parking garages, as well as zoning specific standards. It also covers loading areas. So the use such as office or industrial and the gross floor area of the use and the number of dwelling units in the case of multifamily determines the number and size of loading berths that are required for a property. It also covers drive-through regulations. These regulations indicate how many vehicles stacking spaces are required based on the use. When I say stacking spaces, I mean the point of where you enter the drive-through to the point of service. So point of service could be like the drive-through window, like a pickup food window. It also covers modifications. It does allow applicants to request adjustments to standards and requirements within Chapter 21A 44 if the planning director or transportation director determines that the adjustment would not create an adverse impact, and it is required to accommodate a unique site feature such as the shape, topography of the lot, or if access points were constrained on the property. And then finally, it deals with non-conforming parking and loading. Kelsey just gave a great introduction into what non-conforming means, and so similar to uses, non-conforming parking and loading is parking that doesn't meet the requirements of today, but at one point met those requirements. It does allow for non-conforming parking and loading areas to continue, but expansion or change of use on a property is subject to the provisions of the chapter. So when does the parking chapter apply to a property? It applies when there is new development, when there is expansion, and that can include the creation of one or more dwelling units or increasing the floor area by more than 25%. And it applies when there is a change of use on the property in the general or neighborhood context that increases the number of required parking spaces by 10 or more, or the overall parking spaces by 25%. One exception to the change of use is for properties that were built prior to 1944. They do not have to provide any additional parking beyond what is existing for a change of use. So what determines the number of parking spaces that are required for a property? It depends on the specific use, like single-family homes, apartments, restaurants, retail stores, and it depends on the parking context, which is determined by the zoning district the property is located in. I'm going to first talk about the parking context that Salt Lake City has, and then I will talk about zoning district and land use. So Salt Lake City has 4 different parking contexts: general, neighborhood, urban, and transit. The general parking context has the highest minimum parking requirement. This context is more auto-dependent in scale and parking needs. The neighborhood parking context is areas that have small to moderate scale shopping, gathering, or activity spaces. These spaces are generally located within residential neighborhoods. Think of your 15th and 15th neighborhood, 9th and 9th type areas. And then the urban parking context, these are dense pedestrian-oriented neighborhoods with more intensely developed urban centers where pedestrian activity is high and there is a moderate level of transit access. And then finally, the transit context. This has the lowest parking demand. Generally, there is no minimum parking requirements in the transit context. These are zoning districts that immediately surround mass transit facilities and/or are in the downtown core. So the chart on the left here is taken from the zoning ordinance. Right now, it shows what parking contexts apply to each of the zoning districts. The chart on the right includes some examples of land uses and how many parking spaces are required for that particular land use within each parking context. Generally, developments must provide at least the minimum and no more than the maximum of required parking spaces. There are modifications that an applicant can make for adjusting or increasing the minimum or maximum parking requirement. Those are things that can reduce the actual parking need for the property. These are things like sharing parking stalls among businesses with different peak demand times, affordable and senior housing with lower car ownership, or being close to a track station, or they can provide a parking study that demonstrates different parking needs. So you can see for multifamily use on the chart there on the right, the parking requirements under general and neighborhood are the same for studio and 1 bedroom, but the general parking context, again, this is the parking context with the highest parking requirement, requires 1.25 spaces for 2 or more bedroom units. In the urban parking context, there's no minimum for studios, and 1 bedroom requires half a space per dwelling unit, and 2 bedroom requires 1 space per dwelling unit. The transit context across the board has no minimum requirements. And then the maximum parking requirement for multifamily is also the same across the board. So it's the maximum for a 2+ bedroom is 3 spaces for dwelling units, studio and 1, 2 spaces for dwelling units. For restaurant, tavern, brewery type use, the general neighborhood and urban context all have the same parking requirement, which is 2 spaces per 1,000 square feet of seating area. The general has a maximum of 7 spaces per 1,000 square feet. And then in all contexts, the outdoor seating area maximum is 4 spaces per per 1,000 square feet. So this is just some examples of some of the land uses and their parking requirement under the context. There's a number of land uses listed in the parking chapter in terms of land uses. So if we look at how this would apply to a property in a CG zone, for example, to determine the parking requirements for a CG zone property, we'd look at the table on the left to determine what parking context it falls under. Since it's not in neighborhood, urban, or transit in that list of zoning districts, it falls in the general context. So a multifamily development with 100 family-sized units, for example, let's say 3+ bedrooms, proposed in the CG zone right now would require a minimum of 1.25 spaces per dwelling unit, or a total of 125 parking spaces. If we look at one more example, just to show how it's applied for a property in the RMU zone, looking again at the table on the left, RMU is within the transit context. So the transit context applies to this property. The same multifamily development with 100 family-sized units would not require any minimum parking requirement. It does have a maximum parking requirement. That doesn't mean that a project can't provide that type of parking. There is just not a minimum. So this slide is an example of how the number of parking spaces are currently determined for a CG property. This map shows all of the CG zone property in the city, and the red dots are fixed rail transit stops. As we just discussed, the CG zone falls within the general context, so it has the highest parking requirement. You can see here the property pointed out to the left is not near any transit stop. It's fairly consistent with the definition of how the general context is described, being very auto-centric in scale and location. The property on the right, however, is right next to a transit station. It's also still subject to the general parking requirements because these properties are in the same zone, which currently are subject to the general parking requirement. So under the current regulations, same zone, same parking context. Therefore, the same parking requirements regardless of location. But sometimes, as you can see in the example, very real life, like different contexts in a real life setting. This is another example using RMU zoned property. The RMU zone property falls under the transit context. Again, for reference, that is generally there is no parking requirement. So the property on the left here, not within proximity of any fixed rail stop, has no parking requirement. And then again, the property on the right there is within a fourth of a mile. It's fairly consistent with the description of transit parking context and also has no parking requirement. So that concludes my presentation of just an overview of how Chapter 21A44 works. Before I go into the proposed change for the MU consolidation, does anyone have any questions of how we apply, use what is included in the parking chapter?
That was so helpful. Thank you.
Good. I practiced on some people that are not familiar with planning and tried to make it, very clear, not just so in my head. So
Your old
I'm glad it
Commissioner
worked.
Gale is very grateful.
I didn't use a 7-year-old, but. All right, so moving on to the proposed changes with the MU consolidation. The zones proposed for consolidation into the MU2 and the MU3 zones are already within the neighborhood center context. So for the most part, the majority of those zones listed in neighborhood center context are being consolidated into our MU2 or MU3. So we are proposing to keep MU2 and MU3 assigned to the neighborhood context. And they are also consistent with the description of the neighborhood context parking area. What parking context to apply to the MU5, 6, 8, and 11 zones was more challenging. This is a slide that I showed at the last presentation, but I'm just going to show it again. For example, the MU5 zone would be made up of all of these zones that are circled, and all of those zones fall within different parking context areas. So what we came up with for proposed changes is the number of parking spaces required for a property would still depend on its specific use and the parking context, but for properties in the MU5, MU6, MU8, and MU11, the parking context would be determined by the distance to a fixed rail stop rather than the zoning district. So for example, 2 properties in an MU11 zone might have a different parking context based on their distance to transit. If we look at 2 properties, both in, again, the MU11 zone, one of them, let's say, is a mile away from a fixed rail stop, that property would fall under the general context because general is 3/4 of a mile or more from a fixed rail stop. If we look at the second MU property, for example, MU11, it's located within 1/4 of a mile of a rail stop, and so that would fall under the transit context. So one thing that I want to mention is the chart on the right. It only shows the zones that are being impacted as part of the consolidation. So it only shows zones that are being consolidated into other MU zones. It does not show zoning districts that are not part of the consolidation, but still under those contexts. So these are like the downtown zones, for example, which generally are in the transit context with the exception of D2, which is an urban, and then FBUN1. So those zones will remain in the same context that they are in. So this chart only shows the MU zones that are the zones being consolidated into MU zones in the proposal so that we can just focus on those. And I also want to mention the parking requirements for each of the specific land uses under each parking context are not changing either. So those are just like the examples that I showed with the mixed use, with the multifamily building, with retail. Those actual requirements under each parking context are not changing. So using the same examples that I used earlier in relation to the proposed changes, these are 2 MU11 zone properties. The one to the right, the one to the left is more than 3/4 of a mile from transit. That would be in the general parking context. This one to the right is within 1/4 of a mile of transit. This would fall within the transit context. Same zone, 2 different parking requirements because they now would fall under a different parking context based on their distance. Last example, using the same one from earlier, but this is now MU8, is what RMU is proposed to be consolidated into. General would apply to the one on the left, that is not within a close proximity to transit, and transit context would apply to the one on the right that is within 1/4 of a mile of a fixed rail stop. This is a map showing approximately a representation of where each parking context would apply based on distance to a fixed rail stop. The properties in gray are in the general context. Yellow, neighborhood parking context. Urban is blue, and the transit center parking context is in that purplish color. And then the rail stops are highlighted with those green dots. And then I do have the slides that go over the other changes that we talked about at the last meeting, and I'm happy to touch on those. I don't know that the commission had a lot of questions regarding the other changes. So if there were questions that you wanted to go over just in regards to the off-street parking requirements, I can take those now.
I'm just going to say that probably people were very confused about the other part, so it might do us good to just briefly go over those.
The other changes?
Yeah, because we
sure.
may not have been able to
Yes.
follow it because we were thinking about what the other stuff meant.
About what just happened? Yes, no problem.
Thanks.
I'll go through these, and then if there's any questions related to the stuff I just talked about, we can go back to that. So outside of the off-street parking requirements, there are a couple other proposed changes to highlight. This first slide outlines standards that are proposed to be deleted. So there is a whole chart in the parking chapter that is a parking location and setback table. This table regulates parking location in regards to front corner, interior side, and rear yard, as well as parking lots adjacent to single and two-family zoning districts. What we found is these standards are actually duplicate standards because those regulations are already either regulated in a base zone by the required front yard setback, for example, that has to be landscaped, or in the landscaping chapter that requires a buffer when you're adjacent to single and two-family zoning districts. We did pull up some of the requirements that say it can't be in a front yard in case someone provides a front yard, even if it's not required. So a provided front yard versus a required front yard, parking is not permitted in those areas unless they go through a special process and meet the standards for, not a special process, it used to be a special exception, but if they meet the specific standards for parking in a front yard area, which is their rear yard isn't accessible, that type of thing, for example. We are also looking to delete references to specific zoning districts that are being consolidated. And then there's some zone-specific standards, specifically for the TSA zoning district, that are being removed since the TSA zone is proposed to be consolidated. Other changes are moving of standards. So right now there is a whole section of parking garage design standards. We are proposing moving those and consolidating them with the other parking garage design standards that we have in 21A37, so that all the design standards are located in the same spot for ease of use for us as well as applicants that are designing a project. And the drive-through standards have been moved from there are some standards for drive-throughs in the parking chapter, but there are also some standards for drive-throughs in the accessory uses chapter, and that's chapter 21A40. We're proposing to move those standards from the accessory chapter standard to the parking chapter, and again, consolidating those so that they are all in one place. One thing with the drive-through that we are proposing to do, right now the standards for vehicle stacking are also dependent on parking context, the current parking context. We are proposing to remove parking context in relation to the drive-through standards. It's just, this is a use. It doesn't matter if your fast food joint is right next to a track stop or not. These uses still have the need for this many parking spaces. And so it is just based specifically on use and the number of spaces for that use across the board. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
I have
you
a question about what you just talked about.
Sure.
So how is the standards differentiating between drive-through stacking and parking requirements? Because those are different.
Yeah, they're in different sections of the zoning ordinance. So right now, the off-street parking requirements, there's a whole table with that parking context section above with the zone. So this, I'll just go to it rather than, basically this is in the section of off-street parking, and then it's also in a separate subsection for parking and for drive-through standards. And so we're just removing this context from the drive-through section, not from the off-street parking requirements or the bicycle parking requirements. It would still apply to all the other off-street parking. We're just having parking context not apply to drive-throughs, and that's it. Just because those uses, regardless of where they're located, still generate traffic.
Right. So I guess I'm a little confused then. I mean, I'm getting the parking part, but then how the standards are, where they're moving or being removed regarding stacking.
So the standards for stacking are still going to be moved and will be consolidated from 21A40, which is the accessory chapter, into 21A44. So it has requirements for how long that length can be from the point of entering the drive-through lane to the point of service. And it's dependent on use now. So it's like,
That's
commercial,
what I wanted to
industrial.
clarify. So, yeah, so the stacking is getting moved, but it's dependent on, so yeah, it's separate from the parking requirements. So it's dependent on the specific use related to the drive-through?
Yes.
Okay.
So are you saying that all drive-throughs, regardless of where they actually are, will be a general context parking requirement?
So no, all drive-throughs, regardless of where they are, we're proposed to not have in relation to any parking context. It's just if this is a commercial or retail, let me just pull up the draft really quick.
Well, we just learned we're just going to call those stores. So how are we differentiating what type of a drive-through if we just call it a store?
So the proposed uses within the vehicle stacking spaces, the drive-through section, it's car wash, self-service, or automated food and beverage service uses, gasoline pumps, retail and financial institutions, and then other uses with a drive-through. Right now, for example, in a car wash self-service just requires 3 spaces per bay or stall. And now we're just proposing it by length. So we're proposing all car washes regardless of their context. So it's 3 spaces per bay if it's within the general or neighborhood, and 2 spaces if it's within urban and transit. We're proposing to get rid of the context for drive-through, and it's just if you have a self-service car wash, you can have 60 feet of length. And it's identified car wash automated, it's 200 feet. Food and beverage, 400 feet. So it doesn't matter what zone you're in, and that doesn't matter what context you're in because we're getting rid of the context. It's just for this use, this is the drive-through length that is required.
Drive-through, but what about the parking?
Parking is still going to be based on context with what I had just described previously.
And I'll just jump in for the land use tables. So it's still differentiated with drive-through use. So if it's like retail goods and service with drive-through, pharmacy with drive-through. So we have them with and without, and they're allowed in different areas with.
I wonder if this change will cause some property to be non-complying for parking.
It's possible if they don't have that required stacking length that they...
Not just for drive-throughs, like for everything. Right? Like what if you have a TSAT and you're currently in an urban center context, but then you move to MU5 and then you're nowhere near a transit spot, then all of a sudden you need more parking spaces than you did before.
So again, the parking chapter applies only when one of these 3 things happens. So if you already have a property developed, let's say you developed this RMU property over here under the transit context, which it's currently in, and now it's going to change to the general context, you already have your development. So unless you are now scrapping that development and redeveloping, or if you're expanding that development, or if you have a change of use of that development, that triggers the parking requirement. Otherwise, it's just allowed to stay as a non-conforming parking.
And it will be part of that, like easing into it, like when you allow more expansion than you did before. We were talking about like you're limited to 1,000 square feet larger.
So the parking chapter does have some specific requirements for and allowances for non-conforming parking. So there is some carve out for those. We aren't proposing, at least that I'm aware of to do anything different than we're already doing related to non-conforming parking. I think the carve-outs Kelsey was talking about are related to non-conforming uses that do not include parking, since there's already more detailed standards for non-conforming parking in the parking chapter.
But like this property on the left, they currently maybe have no parking because they weren't required to have any.
Right.
And that's fine. They can keep no parking unless they expand,
Yes.
unless they,
If they get an application in or have, a development on that property with no parking spaces, that can continue. It is when they redevelop the property or expand the use or change the use that would trigger them to come into compliance with the parking requirements.
I would just say that historically that's been our practice with parking regulations. So we used to not have parking regulations, right? And then when we adopted them, we didn't make all of those properties come into compliance with off-street parking. It was as uses changed or properties redeveloped, they would add off-street parking requirements.
in that uses table, that was the one that was recently revisited in the last year for like how many parking spaces you need per 1,000 square feet of office space. Like those were already.
This table here, so the new parking changes as well as like requirements, the context approach, I believe those changes were adopted and in effect at the end of 2022.
Okay. One of the parking trainings that I watched said that when you require 3 spaces or more per 1,000 square feet, then your parking lot gets bigger than your building. So, and there are certainly some situations that are in that category here.
Yes.
So this makes so much more sense, and I just have to say thank you for approaching this so thoughtfully. We all know parking and transit has been a major concern for so many people in this city, and finding the balance between the car-loving history of our population and trying to bring in more transit and encourage more bike commuting and pedestrian more pedestrian use and those types of things, I think is difficult. And I think you've come up with a very solid solution to some of those questions. And so I really appreciate it. And I just want to say thanks. I think this is some good work and a difficult one to work through. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. It was good to have your feedback because that helped us understand where, the confusion was going to be. If our commission's confused, the public is certainly going to be confused. So it was very helpful.
I have one comment and one question. The thought has occurred to me that if I want to reduce parking requirements throughout Lake City, I need to get more rail lines built. So that is now the challenge. One question that I have is, where will drive-throughs be allowed under this new zoning?
So the parking chapter doesn't dictate where drive-throughs can be allowed. That would be back to Kelsey.
Hi.
Gotcha.
That was also a tough one to balance. MU5 was the one we primarily identified with some caveats that it must be located on a state collector street. Is that? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, state collector. So it's fairly limited, but there are existing drive-throughs where MU5 will be mapped. So.
Gotcha. I like the sound of limited drive-throughs. Thanks.
One thing, a little bit kind of going off what he was saying. When in the past, when I've been kind of doing stuff like this on projects, I always thought that it is a little limiting that it's purely based on the fixed rail transit stations, that we get this kind of TSA bump of any kind. And so I do worry that doing it this way is a little bit more having parking responding to how things are now rather than where we might want them to be. Because I know that RMU and I think FBUN2 at least were some of the benefits of those districts were their low parking requirements. So it made development a lot easier, and you could get a lot of kind of small studio apartments and try and get people living there who wanted to bike and things like that. And so could you go back to the map showing
Yes.
the distribution?
Just a couple follow-up things while I'm zooming to the map. Specifically like the FBUN2 zone, we looked at how that was going to be impacting zones that were already within the transit context, and would it be increasing their their parking requirement? And what we found was it largely will not. Like almost every FBUN2 zone property, for example, will still meet the transit context. The one that didn't was the other side village property, which is on Indiana Avenue, and that property is already underway for development. It already has permits in. So there are a couple of properties like that. There are some smaller areas within the new ballpark area zoning that also were impacted, but they were kind of on the line in terms of council discussions of the appropriate zone for those particular properties. We did also look at bus stops. I know you mentioned the rail stop kind of being limiting. It's interesting, over half of the parcels in Salt Lake City are within a fourth of a mile of a high frequency bus stop. And so when we did that map as a possibility, we pretty much got rid of the middle two parking contexts. And so that was kind of the balance that we came to with the fixed rail. We also looked at potentially adding in a reduction for the location to a high frequency bus stop within the chapter where we have where somebody can modify minimums and maximums. And we ended up not doing that again because of the majority of the parcels in Salt Lake City being within that, and also because right now that reduction only applies to affordable housing. And so as part of this, we felt that it was important just to maintain that for affordable housing. And if we want to revisit parking reductions citywide at any point, that would be a subsequent endeavor.
Yeah, I think based on what I recall of where the FBUN2 is, that mostly I'm not as worried about. It's just that's more an example of just like how do we have a zoning context where we kind of try and promote that that less transit-oriented development. The one spot that I did notice though, there's some RMU stuff on State Street, and so State Street around like 17th South, kind of this yellow strip here in between is the one spot that I do think it would be good if that were a slightly higher or slightly less intense kind of parking requirement there, even though it's not right within. I don't know. It seems like State Street is such a like corridor for that's what a place where we want that high development and want to encourage that kind of thing.
So State Street right now, properties that are within the South State Street corridor overlay are all within the neighborhood context, unless they're like in a D2, for example, and that puts them in the urban context. But if they're in the CC, which I think is largely what is on State Street right now, instead of being in the general context, if they're within that overlay, they're within neighborhood. We are proposing to remove that overlay as part of the consolidation, but you can see what it's done to the State Street corridor is half of that is in yellow, the lower half. It's sort of hard to see. I don't know if you can, you can kind of see the cursor. Sorry, you can see the cursor. So this is kind of that corridor here. Before this whole strip was yellow, and now this portion of it falls within the urban context, so their parking requirement will reduce where this just stays the same as it was. The RMU, I'm not sure.
Well, so there's at least a couple of properties on State Street around 17th South that are RMU that would then be going to neighborhood context. So that's what I was thinking of is the development for those, and like whether or not they can still, whether or not we're still trying to make a node there for that kind of low transit housing.
Yeah, right now we are just proposing to keep it based on distance to transit because that was kind of the fairest thing we could think of, you know, because there will be properties that are along areas that are not within proximity to transit that used to be in transit. And so it's kind of hard to pick and choose, like, well, this one used to be in transit. It's still not, you know, within a fourth of a mile of transit, but we'll let it be transit. So that's kind of the decision we made across the board at this point. That's the proposal that we plan to move forward with.
If light rail adds a stop at 17th South, that would change that map too, right?
Yes. So this map isn't being adopted. This is just a proximity map showing what's on the ground now. If a stop were to be removed, that would have the opposite impact.
Yeah.
If a stop is to be added, also would change this map. So this map is just kind of demonstrating in real time right now what we believe the approximate parking context would be for these properties.
And these
And
are
over on Foothill, there's neighborhood center because those are MU 2 and 3. They will be
Yes.
2 and 3 zones.
Yes, those will be neighborhood.
So this is just showing the MU properties, not the D1s and the RMFs and all those.
No, this is just a map highlighting those properties that are involved in consolidation because the other properties they're not changing. This wouldn't impact them, so we're just highlighting the properties that are impacted by this consolidation.
So like D1 will continue to be, their parking context is set by everybody in D1 has the same parking concept.
Yes.
Context. They do now and they will
Yes,
with any changes. Okay.
yes.
Oh, I had a question about bicycles. Is there a requirement for bicycle parking in
Yes.
in the parking chapter?
Yes, so it's currently, it follows the exact same pattern that I talked about just with regular off-street parking. It's the same for bicycles. So what we're proposing is the same for distance to transit. The number of spaces would be required for bicycle based on that for the M5 through M11.
And mixed use means residential plus something else. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So if it's just residential, it's something else. Or if it's something else, it's just something else.
Yeah,
So MU
so
just has
the-
to be residential plus another thing.
So the use, the actual use is dependent on, the requirements are dependent on the use. So for example, this is multifamily. These requirements under general for multifamily, neighborhood, urban, and transit, all of these requirements aren't changing. It's just the context that apply to the MU zones.
So if I had a multifamily over a restaurant, I'd have to do both of these calculations, right?
So there is a mixed use. I just
Yeah.
only included a few examples.
Oh, there's a mixed use category.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
All right.
Any other questions?
I wouldn't expect you to know this, but we went through the adaptive reuse stuff that got adopted not too long ago. Is there anything about parking?
Yes, I do know that because
you
I
do.
processed the adaptive reuse
Well,
application.
sweet, there we go.
Yes, so the adaptive reuse ordinance establishes new minimums. I don't know if you'll remember, but there were 2 tiers of adaptive reuse incentives. The first one was a use incentive. The second one was preserving a building and then allowing those incentives to apply to the new construction as well. So basically, for multifamily, unless there's a lesser parking requirement in the zoning ordinance, it only requires half of a space for adaptive reuse project.
Okay,
All other residential uses are 1 space per dwelling unit. So, for example, in the single-family zoning districts like an R15, that zone requires 2 spaces per dwelling unit, but if it was an adaptive reuse project, it would only require 1 space per dwelling unit. It establishes a new minimum, essentially.
Okay, thanks.
It is very complicated.
Well, if there's no other questions, we can go ahead and wrap this up. And thanks everyone for coming. And let's see, August 28th, Wednesday, August 28th is our next Planning Commission meeting. Thanks.
Have a good one.